I'm also not in principle opposed to assisted dying, but over the past few months my overriding fear has been the process of this thing being slammed through the legislative system with sort of cursory discussions, checks and balances. I think the process has been so shocking that, well, yeah, it's just been incredibly shocking.
Welcome to Assisted. I'm Chelsea Roff. Assisted dying is said to be a compassionate, caring choice.
But in this series, we explore why it's not that simple. I'm Fiona McKenzie, and we'll look at why assisted dying has such a big impact on women.
Assisted death is already a reality in 33 jurisdictions around the world, and the UK's parliaments are talking about it now. We are really delighted to be here today with two leading voices in palliative care and palliative medicine. I'm happy to introduce Professor Katherine Sleeman, Laing Galazka Chair in Palliative Care at King's College London and a consultant in palliative medicine at King's College Hospital, and Professor Mark Taubert, a palliative care consultant at the Velindre Cancer Centre and an honorary professor at Cardiff University School of Medicine. You both have decades of experience in palliative care. What drew you to this work, and what have you learned about how people experience dying in the UK?
Whatever jobs I did, be that general medicine jobs, I've done general practice, I've done internal medicine, gastroenterology, whatever area I worked in, I was always quite interested in how we respect and deal with people who are nearing the end of life. I had quite a few traumatic jobs. I won't go into too much detail of that, but I had a lot of traumatic jobs where people towards the end of life weren't treated particularly well. Myths around pain relief existed, and consultant colleagues weren't giving pain medications adequately, and I saw some pretty horrendous deaths. And I think that kind of formed me, and I sort of always felt like I had a real duty to make sure that that doesn't happen again, and that wherever I can make an impact and change things, people would have more dignity and pain control, symptom control. It always drew me in strangely. I think I say strangely because I think not everyone automatically thinks that they're going to be a palliative care consultant one day, and it's quite specific. I think it draws certain people in, but it was always a draw for me. And I if I could choose again from days of medical student again, I would choose exactly the same career again.
I came to palliative medicine quite late, I think. I actually didn't know that it existed. I went through medical school. I don't think I ever heard the words. And then I did various different jobs, and I ended up doing an oncology job, so cancer medicine, which I absolutely loved. I suddenly felt as though I'd found my home. It was a real epiphany. But as I got a little bit more senior in oncology, I realised that the bit of oncology that I really loved wasn't the bit where you prescribe chemotherapy, essentially. It was the bit where you sit with a patient on the edge of the bed and talk to them about what's most important to them. And so I sort of realised slowly that actually the bit I loved wasn't oncology at all, it was palliative care, so I switched and came into palliative care that way. At the moment, I do work still as a consultant in palliative medicine, but my main job is as an academic, and I suppose what I would say from both my clinical and my research experience is that too many people miss out on palliative care still. Too many people I see in the hospital, I see through my research studies, are not getting the high quality palliative care that they need as they approach the end of life, and that is really what drives me.
And Mark, you've touched on a point there that the assisted dying campaigns will mention a lot, which is that people suffer at the end of life because they don't get enough pain relief. That obviously drove you to look at palliative care as the solution to that. But I guess, do you feel that palliative care can answer all of these problems that the assisted dying is designed to solve?
No, don't think so. I'm quite honest with that. I think when I'm called into a situation where there's pain, then it's complicated, and people have probably already tried a few things, and then we try and put a few more things in place. A lot of the time it works. I mean, I've sometimes seen people come to the hospice or to the cancer center asking for help in dying. They want to make things happen more quickly. You then go through things systematically with them, you discuss it with them, you have long conversations with them in terms of how we can improve things, and then you find solutions, and sometimes the solutions are surprisingly simple. I say most of the time within 2 or 3 days we're on top of the symptoms. And then other things start emerging and other discussions start emerging. I always think about back to one of my patients when I started off in the hospice as a relatively junior doctor, where there was a lady with a lot of pain, and she'd come in really wanting things to end, and we got on top of things very, very quickly. And then very soon it became clear that her son was her entire life, and her son was going to graduate in the summer, and she didn't think she was going to see the graduation ceremony. And then we managed to talk to the university, make lots of phone calls, get lots of things done to bring the graduation ceremony forward and bring it into the hospice. And I think that was really big on her mind as well, and probably fed to her overall symptom burden and the pain as well. But that was relatively easy to get on top of. But it's interesting, really. I think sometimes people mistake the symptoms of pain for suffering. I think suffering has many, many different facets.
So I don't think palliative care can solve all suffering, although it could solve a lot more than it currently does. Many, many people die every year needing palliative care but not receiving it. But I think there will always be some people who just want to die before their bodies do, and palliative care can't solve that. What I would say, though, is in my experience that is less about pain. It's less about physical suffering. It's actually much more often about control, about someone who's had control through life and they want control through death, and that is completely understandable. But actually, I think we're being led to believe through this debate that this is all about severe physical suffering, and actually I don't think that reflects what I've seen in clinical practice. I think it's about control and more about kind of existential suffering.
Yeah. And I think the research, whatever little research there is on that topic, bears that out, or certainly the data bears that out as well. I think in countries where it's legal and they actually record the reason for people wanting to have the assisted dying, it's pain often comes. I think pain comes sixth or seventh.
Way down the list. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. It comes way down the list. And the other thing that is really important in terms of research is there has been research that's been done with people who are in a palliative care setting and they have a wish for a hastened death. And what you find is, first of all, that wish fluctuates. So people have good days and bad days, but also it lessens if they receive palliative care. So high quality palliative care can alleviate that wish for a hastened death.
I mean, that story that Mark told of a woman who was almost thinking about assisted dying, but actually could be best supported by a social intervention, making her life and her relationship with her son better. I think that, wow.
One of the choruses that we've heard in this debate a few times is we can't let the good be the enemy of the perfect, both in terms of the bill, but also the state of palliative care in the UK. And I hold that dichotomy, the reality that there's many people who are not getting the palliative care that they need, and they're saying, in that system, you need to give me another choice. I wonder if you can comment on that.
I think there's a real problem with that because we're talking about a really important topic, death, dying. You can only get it right once. And I wouldn't dream of giving any of my patients some experimental concoction that I didn't have some data on. That everything I do, is cautious, is incremental. And for me, this notion of perfection being the enemy of sort of implementing something like that is, I find it a bit repellent in a sense because I've accompanied so many people in the last weeks or months or years of their life, and I think every step I've just always made it my job to be very careful, and so do my team. So just having some MPs come along and say, oh, we'll just do this and do that, and they've only really dealt with the topic over the last few weeks or so, and suddenly they profess some sort of expertise and let's quickly do this, and they don't understand some of the complexity that me and my colleagues here have seen, and involving a lot of my patients. It really doesn't sit right. I want to invite them to come and see what we deal with on some of our ward rounds. I get calls from the community all the time about really difficult safeguarding situations, unsafe houses. My community colleagues go into homeless hostels sometimes to deal with end-of-life care issues. I mean, we're not talking the sort of middle-class home where people, go on holiday to Switzerland every year. We're talking about really difficult situations. And I think some of the MPs, perhaps if they were presented with some of the vignettes of the things that we actually see, would probably get a little bit of cold feet in terms of what they're proposing at the moment.
Yeah, I agree with Mark. If I could also add, so the thing about palliative care, well, it'll never be perfect. Yeah, but do you know how bad palliative care is in many parts of the country. So it's estimated that every year 100,000 people die needing palliative care but not getting it. 100,000, actually more. So that's about 300 people every day. And you're more likely to get palliative care if you're in certain groups, so if you're white, if you're rich, if you've got cancer, if you live in certain areas. And the worst thing is that some of these inequalities are actually getting bigger over time. We've known about them for a decade, probably more, and we're watching them get worse. And we know that they're going to get worse into the future because the number of people who have palliative care needs is going up because of population ageing. So we're essentially sitting back watching this happen. There are a few facts that I think really exemplify how little prioritisation of palliative care there has been. So, for example, in 2011, NICE, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, recommended that everyone has access to a 24/7 palliative care telephone advice line. We did a study a couple of years ago that found that just 1 in 3 areas consistently provides that, more than a decade after the national body said everywhere has to have this. Similar thing, every hospital is supposed to have 7-day face-to-face palliative care services. Still, 40% just don't. So that means that if you're dying in a hospital at the weekend, well, toss a coin about whether you'll be able to see a specialist palliative care nurse. I agree that we can probably never get palliative care to absolutely perfect for absolutely everyone, but the gulf between where we are and where we need to be is so extraordinarily large, it really worries me that we're pouring all this energy and effort into providing a law that will suit a very, very small proportion of people, and each of those individuals is very important. But the knock-on consequence is all of the other people who are currently missing out will continue missing out.
Yeah.
But you asked 2 questions, Chelsea, because you also said this kind of, well, let's not let perfect be the enemy of good in terms of the assisted dying law, and that's really critical. So Mark and I know from clinical practice that no assisted dying law can be 100% safe. It's impossible. There will be people who slip through the net. The question we should be asking as a society is not, do we want this, yes or no, but who is at risk, how at risk are they, and what safeguards will reduce those risks to levels that we, as a society, find acceptable. That's the conversation we need to be having if we want to legalise this. Pretending it's going to be perfect it's deluded, actually, and it's misleading. This won't be perfect, so we as a society need to start thinking about what margin of error we would find acceptable.
Yeah, it's a very good point, actually. Very good point. And for some of us, that margin of error might be very different to others, but I think everyone should have all the information on the table.
We
I
need
just
to have a
wanted to,
conversation about it,
yeah,
don't we? Because I think the public think if you mention the word safeguards enough, it's going to be 100% safe.
yeah,
That's
that's
not
right.
reality.
Yeah. One of my patients, Katherine, moved away from this area. She moved away from Wales to somewhere in England. And she phoned me up and said, Mark, there's no palliative care here. She'd been someone I'd been seeing in my clinic for several years, and it was nearly a cry for help. Please, can I stay in touch with you because I can't access palliative care here. I don't know how the system works. My GP says the palliative care consultant is in another county and isn't quite sure how to get hold of them. And what if she suddenly decides, well, there's nothing here, but there's a law for assisted dying. Maybe I'll just crack on with that then.
Is there the most horrible mathematics going on here? We spoke to a palliative care expert in Canada, and she said that some of the operational budgets for palliative care now actually fund assisted dying. So they actually use that budget for assisted dying. And I just wonder, is there a government utilitarianism which says, why pour billions of pounds into palliative care? Because it's just cost, these people are dying anyway. And I just wonder why is palliative care not funded by government to the extent that why is it 70% is funded by charities?
70% of hospice care is funded by charities, but palliative care is much bigger than hospice care. It's a possibility, isn't it, that financial pressures could be maybe not driving this, but an incentive. Who knows? I think it would be really interesting when we see that impact assessment, because presumably it will tell us information like what costs or cost savings assisted dying might have over the next 5-10 years. If that impact assessment says that assisted dying is likely to save money, well, then I think we need to think very carefully about whether this is part of the NHS, because having an intervention like this as part of the NHS that saves money, given the financial pressures that NHS hospitals are under, I find that quite a difficult concept, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I just read these figures in the British Medical Journal just at the start of the week, but do you know how much the UK spends on healthcare for people in the last year of life per year? Would you have a sort of guesstimate, Chelsea, on that one, or Fiona?
I mean, I don't
Come
know
on,
whether to say
give us a
I don't know
number.
whether to say £16 or 800 billion. Like I have no idea. I can't imagine it's
So
enough.
it's 11.7 billion. Okay, so the UK spends 11.7 billion pounds on healthcare for people in the last year of life, and for every £5 of this, £4 is spent in hospital. Okay, so I hope there's not some sort of manager or politician looking at cost savings listening to this podcast, because obviously their ears will prick up immediately if they hear that sort of figure. If you think some of those people in the last year of life might opt out and not go for that and go for an assisted death instead, I mean, there's billions in savings in there. And in fact, so much so that I think places like Canada, they can't go back. They
Mm.
cannot go back. The cost economic argument is absolutely overwhelming. I mean, sometimes it's dressed up, the argument, as, oh, we're doing this for society. We have to do this in the name of progress, and people want this, etc. But the cost economic argument is so strong for this.
I think that this debate is already taking resource away from palliative care because everyone's spending so much time thinking about assisted dying and not palliative care. I mean, think about what people are doing in government at the
Yeah.
moment. They're not
Yeah.
focusing on palliative care.
I'm hearing that from Australia and Canada as well, from palliative care colleagues saying, Christ, wherever you stand on the assisted dying debate, it completely takes all the oxygen out of the room for all our other patients. The ones who want to access assisted dying, it takes it all up. It's all encompassing.
Yeah.
The whole focus is suddenly on that
Yeah.
topic. It's a
So
real vampire.
So there's some data on that from Canada that basically shows that when assisted dying is happening, for example, on a palliative care unit, the palliative care team want to do a gold-plated assessment, gold-plated care for that person who is about to have an assisted death, because they want to make sure that no stone is left unturned in terms of any reversibility to their suffering. But the consequence of that is less palliative care for people having sort of ordinary deaths on the ward. So even if it's not a kind of mathematical health economic, that £1 million is shifted, actually there are other ways in which legalisation of assisted dying does impact on people dying in the ordinary way.
I'm so glad you've spoken to these. There's perverse incentives is what comes to mind, economically, socially, in terms of people not having access to palliative care. It feels a little bit like this bill is being sold on slogans. And you both, and I don't mean that in an unkind way. There's a lot of slogans, but there's
Please be
behind.
unkind. Please be as unkind as you want to be.
That's the nature of politics. But beneath the slogans, there has to be evidence, and I want to ask you about some of these slogans. So specifically, one of the things we're told is that this will only be offered to people who are dying anyway, and the safeguard that they've presented with this slogan is they must have 6 months or less to live, or perhaps even 12 months if you've got a neurodegenerative disorder. How certain can you be as physicians about prognosis at this time of life?
When someone is very close to the end of life, you can be quite sure about that in someone. If you think they have hours or days to live, they probably do. But the further away from the very end of life you get, the more difficult it becomes. The data actually shows that in terms of understanding whether someone is likely to die within 6 or 12 months, the situation is toss a coin. Doctors get it wrong as much as they get it right. All of the evidence tells us that you can't do it accurately. In a way, though, I guess I find that 6-month line in the sand so arbitrary, so meaningless, that it sort of doesn't really bother me that doctors are going to get it wrong, because I think that clause is there to make the bill more palatable. In my mind, it doesn't make it more safe. Why would it be safer for someone to do this when they've got 3 months to live rather than when they've got 9 months to live? It doesn't make any sense to me as a safeguard. If anything, my bigger problem with that 6-month rule is that it's discriminatory, which I think is a much more serious problem. And because it's an arbitrary number, because that 6-month clause doesn't rest on firm foundations, almost certainly what we'll see over time is it will shift, as we already have, in fact, in terms of that 12-month amendment that's been proposed.
Sideline here. I go running with 2 weather presenters. So shout out to Derek Brockway and Sue Charles, if you're listening, BBC weather presenters, and we often talk about things like forecasting and prognostication, and we sort of compare notes in our jobs, and And poor Derek and Sue, they get it wrong quite a lot of the time, and they often say though the 24-hour forecast is much easier for the weather than say the 6-day, 7-day forecast. And then I sometimes say, look, in the recent assisted dying debate, I could say my 6-day forecast is obviously going to be immensely more accurate than my 6-month forecast or my 6-week forecast. Even 6 weeks is tricky. I mean, I see some patients who are great 6 weeks before their death, absolutely fine, holding jobs, doing different things, and then 6 weeks later they're dead. So I think it's very, very difficult. I work in the cancer center here, and the trajectories are changing hugely. 5 years ago, I would have had a different discussion with you about this, but now with all these different new novel
Yeah.
treatments, immunotherapies, and various other things, some patients you think are going to do quite well, actually they dip quite rapidly because of the toxicity of some of the new treatments that are there. But some, I kind of discharge from my clinic now because I just don't know. And my prognostication is once we're on top of the symptoms, well, here's my card. Just get back to me when you need me again. Just the other day I saw a patient who had end-stage bronchiectasis written on her notes 15 years ago. First mention of end-stage bronchiectasis was 15 years ago, and she's fine, she's okay, but 15 years ago one might have expected, okay, yeah, we could say 6 months, that's okay. That makes me feel very uncomfortable.
I was just going to say, in my clinical practice, which is a lot of people living with dementia, older people, multiple medical conditions, many of my patients would fit into a category where they might die in 3 months or they might die in 3 years. I mean, many of them. Would they be eligible under this law? It depends how I interpret that 6 months. I mean, yeah, you might die within 6 months. So are you in? I don't know.
I mean, that matters because you could have someone who, in a moment of depression or despair, ask for help to end their life, who could have gone on, as in your example, Mark, to live for 15 years with their family, with their friends. So that's why it's important to be based on evidence.
Yeah. And she's managed some key milestones in that time as well. Her friends and family will remember those key milestones. You just don't know.
This bill defines a terminal illness, in addition to that 6-month prognosis, as an irreversible and inevitably progressive condition. I wonder if you could say more about that. What does irreversible mean in medicine, and how easy is that to determine?
I mean, I can make a start on that. I mean, there's certain conditions that might fall into that, like type 1 diabetes mellitus, to some degree type 2 diabetes mellitus. There's some things that are likely going to be with you for the rest of your life, and you will likely find that is essentially what shortens your life. So I think there's a huge interpretability. The mind comes into this as well, and I think this is a topic that's close to your heart, Chelsea. If you go down a certain track and your mind is telling you that stopping eating is the right thing for you to do at this moment in time, you can create an irreversibility as well, and that worries me. If you want to jump the hoops of something and make something irreversible, you can create that fairly quickly, and I think that's a real danger point for me.
I've just got the bill up in front of me because I really struggle with the wording of that section. So essentially says the person has to have inevitably progressive disease or illness that can't be reversed by treatment and death reasonably expected within 6 months. So let's take, for example, someone with a new diagnosis of cancer. Let's imagine they're in their 80s, it's a lung cancer. There will be some treatment that can be offered to them, and it is likely to be able to reverse that condition. Their tumour might even shrink to the state that you can't see it anymore. But they might think, as people often do, but I don't want to have that treatment. Chemotherapy comes with tons of side effects. It's horrible, toxic stuff. Actually, if it's only going to give me an extra few months of life, I would rather live out my life without that and do all the things I want to do. I think that person would not be eligible for assisted dying within the wording of this bill. I think the wording of this bill suggests that that person would have to have the chemotherapy to prove that there's nothing that can reverse their disease in order to be eligible for assisted dying, which makes absolutely no sense. It means that people essentially have to have toxic, burdensome, unsafe and expensive treatments just to prove their eligibility. So I think that it's really oddly worded. And ultimately what will happen is it will just come down to the interpretation of the doctor sitting in front of them.
I would also add that what we've seen in Oregon and in several US jurisdictions, because there's no requirement that the person exhaust all forms of treatment available that's in the bill itself, how physicians have interpreted this type of definition of terminal illness is, well, because the person has refused treatment, their condition is irreversible. And so that's why we've seen in Oregon, diabetes has been a qualifying condition, HIV/AIDS, hernias, anorexia
But
nervosa.
the thing is, you can't make your patients have treatment. Like that's a fundamental medical ethic is patients have the right to refuse treatment. So it's a total catch-22. One or the other, it can't be both. It's a real problem, I agree.
And that's why a condition like diabetes can fall within this, is because you can't force someone to undergo treatment. And if they're refusing treatment, their condition is irreversible. That's how it's been framed.
Yeah. Which is absolutely not what this bill is intended to do. You know, I totally believe that that couldn't be further from the supporters of this bill's minds. But we have to take heed of what has happened in other jurisdictions, don't we? We can't just shut our eyes to them and pretend they haven't happened.
Mark, this is something you've done a bit of work on. Is you've talked about you're very careful as a physician. You want to give your patients things that you think will work. You don't just test random combinations of drugs on them. But the drugs that are used in assisted dying, I mean, are they experimental, or is there good evidence base for those?
Not experimental for that purpose. All of them have been tried and tested for different intentions. For instance, drugs like phenobarbital I sometimes use for seizure management, but at 100th of the dose that they're sort of given for assisted dying. They are experimental for that setting. I suspect people just have thought, okay, in very high doses these drugs will work, but there's been no proper trials on this. There's often as just goes on data put forward by organizations that organize assisted dying. And so you have to kind of say, okay, now we have to rely on them reporting their data correctly. Now, if I was a big supporter of assisted dying and was giving these drugs every single day to people, I'm sure people watching this will probably hate me for what I'm going to say, but maybe I'd have a vested interest in sort of saying, well, everything's okay here. It's a controversial topic, but don't worry. All our patients are safe and everything is okay. So when I'm writing it up later on, maybe I'll downplay some of the symptoms that may be occurring during that time. Nonetheless, some of the data that we do get through does suggest that there are some issues with these medications. So even more, if there's some indication that there's high complication rates here with things like pain, seizures, prolonged deaths, not dying at all, then let's have some really good independent funded studies that go through a proper R&D process, proper university scrutiny process, proper ethics where people are perhaps not vested interest and we'll test this out. I don't trust some of the data that I see, and from the data that we do see that is perhaps been filtered by people, even then it suggests high complication rates. So these are drugs that are not licensed for that purpose in any of the jurisdictions in the world. And the reason for that is because, is this a treatment? Is death a treatment? So you're going into a completely different sphere here in terms of the intention of what you're trying to do. My instinct as a doctor and as a prescriber and as a palliative care person is every drug I give, I want to give with caution. That's my instinct. If you want me to switch that off completely, because I'm giving it for the intention of causing someone's death, then that's a completely different narrative.
Is your sense, just quickly, that the bill that's in Westminster has enough reporting and data collection in it to make that happen?
No, I mean, again, this bill is so vague. The danger in this bill, the first time I read it, I thought, what, only 40 odd pages? If I'd tried to write something like that, I think it would have probably ended up with 400 pages, and probably even that isn't enough. No, there's very little detail on this, and I think people would, potentially be marking their own homework, And now they're even saying, if you have too much scrutiny, it puts people off. In places like Australia, they're saying, this is a barrier. If you have too much scrutiny, too much inspection, it puts people off. We certainly don't want the coroner involved. We don't want the medical examiner involved. And then they're saying, well, there's been so much scrutiny of this assisted death already. But yeah, what about the dying moments? What about the time from ingestion of the drug to the death? And what do you do if suddenly some family member, when you're in the room while the death happens, says something really suspicious that makes you think of coercion? All the scrutiny has happened beforehand. Now you can't do anything anymore maybe you can't even raise it with the coroner anymore because they say, well, we don't usually investigate those kinds of deaths. That's so much scrutiny that we don't need to look into it. I mean, for me, that's a huge problem, and it's just not the way end of life care works, because things happen at all stages. Things sometimes come to light 6 months after the death, and then do you not open up a case again because it's got the protection of being within an assisted dying framework? No, it doesn't work for me.
We hear all the time, we just need to use the evidence from abroad. There's so much evidence now. But what people miss is that evidence is retrospective aggregate data from a form filled out by the doctor who wrote the lethal prescription. After the person's died, no independent verification. I think we could do better than that, actually. And the bill is pretty empty on what the reporting, it says reporting needs to occur, but it doesn't say how or what. And I would suggest prospective scrutiny would be really important.
Yeah.
Just very briefly on the drugs. So if you look around the world at the different drugs and different drug combinations are used, what you find is that a different drug/combination is used everywhere. And that is because there is no data on safety and efficacy. So people are going, well, that looks good, and should we add a bit of that just to, make sure? These drugs need to be tested for, are they safe? So do they not cause difficult symptoms like vomiting, regurgitation, fitting when the person dies? And they need to be tested for, are they efficacious? Do they work? Some of the oral combinations, on the whole, people die within an hour, which I imagine is acceptable, but some people take many hours and sometimes days to die. So the fact that these drugs just haven't been tested, you can see that in that kind of data.
Yeah, and there's been some more recent data, I think in 2025, from the United States, which I read, with great interest. But then it's slightly disappointing then to read that the authors of that paper are sort of the people who are sort of delivering the services as well, and for me that reminds me a little bit of. You remember, Katherine, in the junior doctor days, you'd sometimes be asked to critically evaluate a paper, basically. One of the first things you would check is basically whether it was funded by the pharmaceutical company or not, basically. And if it was funded by the pharmaceutical company, you might sort of think, okay, maybe the spin here is towards a positive spin towards the drug, and then inevitably that would be the case. For me, obviously, in the general public, won't necessarily know how to scrutinize a paper and filter out some of the nonsense data that comes out of things. And so you want as unbiased as a piece of research as you probably can. You want it to have gone through proper R&D scrutiny. You want it to have gone through proper ethics as well. And you want some evidence that it's written by people who don't have any gain from this, or are not protecting something or ring fencing something in a sense. Because I could do a paper about my palliative care department here and how we work, and I'd write a really nice paper, and it might read fantastically well. But if an external person comes in with no beef in it at all, you'd probably trust that paper a lot more as an evaluation of my palliative care service than my own one, which might be heavily biased.
At
Yes.
minimum, you would want a declaration of competing interests in the paper, which is often lacking. I'm so glad you brought up the Oregon data, because what I think many people in the UK don't know is that in the US it was experimental drugs, and none of the drug combinations have ever been approved by a regulatory agency like the Food and Drug Administration. They haven't gone through any of the regulatory frameworks. And often the research that's out there didn't even go through an institutional review board, because they couldn't get it through the institutional review board because of the ethical issues with it. So it was guerrilla style research to develop these, and that's why the complications were quite high in the earlier years. And I don't think there's anything in this bill that outlines clearly what the regulatory framework would be in the UK.
And it wasn't even discussed in the oral evidence. You think that what drugs are going to be used would be absolutely critical in those sessions. We didn't have time to even, I think it was mentioned by maybe one person.
Yeah.
I'm looking at a list of all of the drugs that are used around the world for injection, for euthanasia. And what is striking is not only how many drugs are on the list, it's 25, but the ranges in terms of the doses. So I'm just going to read out a few. Propofol, which is an anaesthetic agent, 1,000 to 2,000 milligrams. So double it. Midazolam, 2 to 120 milligrams. So times by, in some places they're using 60 times the doses routinely. Fentanyl, 25 to 1,500 micrograms. It's nuts, the variation that
Could,
exists.
just for a layperson, because we hear about a good death, this is often sold as a good death. Could you just lay out what are some of those drugs? So you said an anesthetic. Am I correct that in some countries they use paralytic agents so that if the person were to wake up, they might not even be able to voice that
So
they.
the drugs on this list fall into four groups, kind of sedatives, hypnotics, anesthetic type agents. So they put you to sleep, basically. Analgesics take away pain, things like morphine. Neuromuscular blockers. Now, I believe that they are part of the cocktail because sometimes when people are given the other drugs, they fit or seize or jerk, and you want to dampen that down. And then the fourth group of drugs are cardiotoxic agents in order to stop your heart. I think that there is a theoretical risk that if the patient takes longer to die than expected, that sedative might wear off, but the neuromuscular blocker doesn't allow them to express that they're aware. So I think that, yes, that is a theoretical risk, but I'm not sure we have very much data at all on that.
And how would you do informed consent with a patient? So, like, can you even do informed consent with these cocktails in terms of going, these are the risks?
I don't even know how I'd begin to do that, apart from explaining that, sometimes medicines like digoxin are used. So, digoxin is there to slow your heart down. And yeah, I mean, I suppose how you would describe it is that you want to bring about a cardiorespiratory arrest. And in a sense, you're doing that to a body that isn't quite ready for its cardiorespiratory arrest yet, because it might be weeks, months, or even years away from its natural dying event. So let's compare an artificial dying event brought on by these drugs to a natural dying event. So a natural dying event, and Katherine will know this, usually involves the body going into slowdown mode a lot of the time. So a palliative care patient will sort of, over the weeks take to the bed more. They'll be asleep a lot more of the time. I suppose the each organ perhaps goes into slowdown mode, and this is sort of a natural death where the kidneys slow down, the liver slows down, the whole sort of your appetite reduces, your whole system sort of goes into a slowish shutdown mode, and then the last things to go really are the heart, the lungs, and the brain in a sense. That's the natural way of an ordinary death, which often means that the most deaths that we would typically see, the patient is asleep in the last 24 or 48 hours of life. Sometimes don't even need any symptom control medication during that time. I've seen plenty of patients who are not even on a syringe driver and don't need any additional drugs, but they're there if they're required. By contrast, then a death that is artificially brought along, essentially the death will be a death by cardiorespiratory arrest, a death by asphyxiation in a sense. So a chemically induced asphyxiation event, where in a sense you kind of knock out the heart and the respiratory system and the brain first in an otherwise functioning body still. The body might be weakened due to disease, cancer, chemotherapy, and various other things, but it's still a body that will fight that process. And you don't know how much it'll fight that process. So in a younger person, it might fight the process more than, say, in a person who's maybe in their 90s, for instance. But you have a lot of uncertainty there. So the consent process is very, very difficult because you don't actually know what is exactly going to happen in that person's individual circumstances. We know, for instance, as well that oral medications are hugely unreliable in the assisted dying process. For starters, you don't know how much is going to be absorbed. You hear examples in Parliament of people citing people vomiting their own feces who are in bowel obstruction. Well, you couldn't give them an oral concoction of toxic drugs. You just couldn't, because they'd vomit it up, or it wouldn't be absorbed properly, or would just sit in their stomach where none of it would be absorbed. So for those, you would have to set them an IV infusion, for instance, and then give them medications in that way. That raises questions for me as well in some ways in the delivery of these medications, but you have to have a patient who's competent enough to then press some sort of release mechanisms for it to be started. But what of the doctor who's setting all these things up, who's setting up, or the nurse or the pharmacist or the team who are setting all these things up? How do they feel about setting all these medicines up? What sequence do you give it in? Because you damn well want to make sure that the sedative kicks in before the, say, neuromuscular blocker does, because I don't want to be, if I'm dying, witness to my own musculature, my cardiorespiratory system kind of going into shutdown mode. I want to be fast asleep when that happens. So if I press the button, does that mean I get the sedative first? And then do I have to press the button again for the toxic mix to go in? Or will I be asleep for that to happen? Or how does it all work? There's so little detail on this. There's stuff that I don't know about this. I try and find out. I've phoned colleagues in Germany. I've spoken to people in Switzerland. But again, this whole area is sort of shrouded in a little bit of, well, let's not get outside people to interfere too much because we don't want too much criticism. That doesn't work for me at all.
For a campaign that has really pushed this idea that we don't talk about death enough, I feel like they haven't really actually talked about assisted death very much. And I think it's important for people to know this before consenting to this. I worry that it's being sold as a good death and you just fall asleep and you're surrounded. We had a colleague who was on who said, she got in, it was a young woman with anorexia who got into a hug circle with her family, was what it was said in the study, and just fell asleep. But that I don't know if even the MPs are aware of what this death actually looks like.
Yeah, I don't think it's even being sold as a good death. I think it's being sold as a Hollywood death. It's being sold
Yeah.
as a sort of almost glamorous death. I'm going to have my glass of champagne in one hand and the beautiful, sunset over the sea in the other. That's not going to happen. That's not going to.
No.
It's not going to be like that.
And death and dying actually induce a lot of stress in people as well. And I can imagine in some scenarios where maybe a death isn't happening quickly enough for the relative in the room, and they suggest, maybe hastening things along. And maybe the healthcare professional who's in the room is so distressed that they might go along with it even. I bet you those scenarios have happened across the world and we haven't heard about them. I bet you this has happened. I've been I've been around in palliative care for long enough to know how stressful these situations at the end of life can be. And I think once you've gone down that road of saying, well, an assisted death is okay, then you might feel more inclined to help things along if the standard pathway of assisted dying hasn't quite kicked in yet. You might want to do other things as well. I mean, in Germany, it strikes me that some clinicians have really been emboldened by the fact that assisted dying is legal there now. And some are sort of actually going outside the existing frameworks, even over there, and testing the ground a bit. So you get patients with schizophrenia, with bipolar disorder who've had assisted deaths. And, you kind of really kind of think initially the legislation wasn't drawn up with anything like that in mind. So they're panicking in Germany. They're wanting to set far more clear legislation on this. And actually, I've also noticed that they haven't put in sufficient suicide prevention as well, because general suicides are going up in Germany as well in parallel.
Hey, can I just sort of end with something that is really bothering me about this bill?
I thought you were going to end with a joke. Just,
No, you know me, Mark. You're here for the jokes.
oh, come on.
Okay, so one of the things that I find unfathomable about this bill is that there at no point does the doctor have to ask the person why they want to die. The doctor just has to check whether they're eligible. Do you live in the right place, your right age, your right terminal illness, capacity consent, you're through. It is so opposite to clinical reality. I had someone in front of me the other day in clinical practice saying that they wanted to die, and what we did, of course, was suicide prevention, psychiatry, palliative care, social support, occupational therapy. Fast forward a couple of years, how do we know whether the person needs suicide prevention or whether they need assisted dying?
Come on, Catherine. You're just creating
baffles me.
barriers. You're just creating barriers again, aren't you? I mean, come on. Asking them why they might want to do it, that's terrible.
It's
It's
so
really-
If the
mental. It is so
Americans
mental.
if the Americans heard about this, they'd have you go to jail for impeding their death.
For creating a barrier.
That's right. That's
I feel like as palliative care doctors, just briefly, are almost unanimously against assisted dying. Is that fair?
80%.
Yeah.
80% are against, 5% are for, and 15% are unsure, neutral, or somewhere in the middle. So yes, but the next most anti-group of doctors are geriatricians, and I think that it is quite interesting that they are both the groups of professionals who spend most of their time with people who are very vulnerable and frail and coming
Yeah.
towards the end of life.
Yeah, as I see, we're the people who get the phone calls from the social worker. I've missed coercion on several occasions, and the clever social worker has phoned me up and said, "Do you know what's happening at home?" And we're the community palliative care GPs and various others are the ones who go into the homeless shelters, into the prisons, into those locations where a lot of other people maybe don't access so much. So it's a hugely contentious area, and I can understand why some people would want this. I can certainly conclude I'm not completely against assisted dying, but this bill I'm completely against. I would really welcome something a lot more detailed than this bill, and then we can actually have a proper discussion, because the vagueness of this bill, the 200 plus amendments that they've put in, it makes this complete nonsense, and I think they need to pull this back and write something new for us to have a proper discussion.
I'm also not in principle opposed to assisted dying. I was always worried about the practicalities of it, and that people might be coerced or nudged or gently pressured into doing it, and how that would work. But over the past few months, my overriding fear has been the process of this thing being slammed through the legislative system with sort of cursory discussions, checks and balances. We've all heard. I think the process has been so shocking that, well, yeah, it's just been incredibly shocking.
And it just feels to me that they're saying anything just to get it to the next step. It seems like the first step was, oh, this is the safest bill in the world. Then they got it through second reading, and now they're just doing everything to make it sound of, oh, this is so safe. We've checked all the other jurisdictions. It's fantastic there. There's no problems at all. They're saying everything just to get it done. It sounds like get Brexit done. That's what it reminds me of.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. It feels as though the objective here is law change at any cost, and safety is a secondary, tertiary consideration. And for a bill of this magnitude, that's so far from appropriate.
Hi, it's Fiona. I just want to remind you that this podcast is totally unfunded. Chelsea and I were so keen that we start to hear some really detailed debate on what assisted dying could look like here in the UK for women. We do not have big money funding, so if you'd like to support us, you can go over to our Substack and subscribe there, or you can donate to The Other Half on our website, theotherhalf.uk/donate. So grateful for this, and so grateful for you listening, though. Thank you.